Chris Hedges, journalist, writer, and activist, it says here. But that's rather like saying Cristiano Ronaldo is a footballer. He's a very special footballer, and Chris Hedges, a very special journalist, writer, and activist. And he joins us now. Chris, thank you for coming on board. Let's start with that first question, or the question on our poll that I've just launched there. Do you think the US and UK governments should recognize the Taliban? Yes, no, or depends?
No, without question. But of course, the United States has already shuttered diplomatic relations, but worse than that, it has frozen the reserves of the central bank, $9.5 billion. The IMF will no longer give access to its lenders' resources. And we have to remember that grants from the United States and other countries accounted for 75% of the Afghan budget. So as all of this assistance instantly evaporates, it will compound a very dire humanitarian crisis. The UN is already raising the alarm. 14 million Afghans, that's 1 in 3, who lack sufficient food. 2 million Afghan children who are malnourished. Close to 4 million people in Afghanistan have been displaced from their homes. A drought destroyed 40% of the nation's crops last year. Already seeing shortages of food and skyrocketing food prices. That severance, we were paying the salaries of the army and most of the civil servants. The health service will clearly collapse. And that's what they want. The empire, like a wounded beast, wants to orchestrate a humanitarian crisis of biblical proportions. And I think you can go back and look at what the United States through the UN did in Iraq. UNICEF estimates that 500,000 children died as a direct result of sanctions imposed on Iraq. And I fear that child deaths in Afghanistan, given the response of the United States, will soar above that horrifying figure. So it's not just that we should recognize the Taliban. I think you could actually make a pretty strong case that we should pay reparations. But we're just putting a noose around the necks of the most vulnerable and poorest Afghans, not something particularly new, looking at what we did during the 9 years when we spent anywhere from $9 to $20 billion visiting hell on earth to Afghanistan to drive out the Soviets.
There are many reasons why that US response is foolish, not to even go onto the terrain of morality, but foolish from the standpoint of American statecraft, because as sure as eggs is eggs, that will force the Taliban-controlled Afghanistan to move increasingly, perhaps wholly, into the economic, political and diplomatic orbit of the neighboring countries.
Yes, and it will also fuel, I mean, they have nothing to lose in that sense. I mean, you look at the U.S. policy towards Iran, the recalcitrance on the part of U.S. policymakers to work with Iran wiped out the reformist sector, there was one within the Iranian government, and bolstered the hardliners. The Taliban, I don't know the Taliban well, but it's a very fractious group. There are 4 major ethnicities, but a total of roughly 20 ethnicities in the country. This kind of policy will give credence to the hardliners. Yes, of course, it's very foolish, but I think you can go all the way back to 1979 when we decided to visit another Vietnam on the Soviet Union. The Soviet had intervened in Afghanistan to prop up a very weak Marxist government, but that was part of the plan. When you go back and look at Brzezinski, this was Zbigniew Brzezinski was Carter's national security advisor. This was part of the plan to lure the Soviet union in. They funded the most radical mujahideen groups, essentially obliterating the secular democratic Afghan opposition. I mean, we hear all this talk about human rights for women. Well, human rights for women under the old Afghan government in Kabul were quite good. And the fact, the horror that we have visited, 1 million Afghans were killed in that conflict with the Soviets, 90,000 Mujahideen fighters, 18,000 Afghan troops, and about 15,000 Soviet soldiers. But all of these deaths were in the calculus of the American empire worth it. And again, I would go back to Iraq and look at the kinds of statements that were made, particularly by, at the time, the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, Madeleine Albright, when asked on a show here, 60 Minutes, whether the deaths of 500,000 Iraqi children caused by the sanctions was worth it, she answered yes. So there is a kind of self-destructive quality, you know, the power to destroy, given the size and reach of the U.S. military, is an intoxicating drug that becomes its own justification. And I think we also have to acknowledge that the chaos that is sowed, the United States CIA is not virtually not an intelligence gathering community. It runs rogue paramilitary organizations around the globe, interrogating people at black sites and often torturing them, carries out targeted assassinations, and also orchestrated commando raids in Afghanistan that killed a large number of civilians and sent enraged villagers and family members into the arms of Afghan civilians. That's there's a self-perpetuating quality to empire, which is ultimately self-destructive. And as we speak, we see Saleh, who was Ashraf Ghani's vice president, holed up in the Panjshir Valley. He's declared himself the legitimate caretaker president. You have Afghan Massoud, Mohammed Atta-Noor, Abdul Rashid Dostum. They're all clamoring to be armed and supported. Indeed, Massoud wrote an op-ed piece in the Washington Post a couple days ago that talked about how his fighters needed U.S. weapons and ammunition and supplies. So it's just this perpetual war that the United States has visited now on almost 4 decades on Afghanistan. And I don't see it ending, given the way the empire works and the fact that the entities, the intelligence agencies that carry out these kind of dark wars are beyond public scrutiny and beyond public view.
Now, Massoud, he's the son of the former leader of the former Northern Alliance. He's educated at Oxford and Sandhurst, which tells you quite a lot, I think. He's crying out for arms and diplomatic and the kind of media and so on support that the Mujahideen once had. Is he likely to get it? Does the United States have the stomach for, as it were, becoming the foster parent of another civil war in Afghanistan?
Yes, and that is the pattern that the United States operates under. I mean, go back and look at what happened after the 1979 overthrow of the Shah. They funded some, pretty nefarious resistance groups who were labeled internationally as terrorist groups. That is how they operate. Their goal now is to make the Taliban pay, and of course the people who really pay are the most vulnerable in Afghan society, and destabilize the country as much as possible to cripple it. I would be shocked if the CIA was not at this moment working out arms transfers and support with Massoud and Saleh and Noor and Dostum and everyone else.
Now, all of this, I know that American media and so on refuses to use the word defeat, but anyone with 2 brain cells to rub together knows that the Taliban won the war, the United States and its allies lost it. And it's a bitter defeat to swallow, no doubt. But how damaging has it been to President Biden? Followed now hard on the heels with the footage of him falling asleep, literally. I thought he'd perhaps passed away, he'd been bored to death by Bennett. But I see that that's now becoming a bigger story. Is this the end of Joe Biden, is what I'm saying?
I mean, of course, this was a bipartisan catastrophe. Remember, Barack Obama used to run around calling Afghanistan the good war. He oversaw a surge into Afghanistan of, I think, 30,000 troops. So it's been a bipartisan effort. There's no Chuck Schumer supported Trump's massive proposal over $700 billion to in the Pentagon budget, and increased by 10%. So there's no daylight on the parties. But of course, you're right. The Republican Party has attempted to use this very humiliating and swift defeat as a way to hurt Biden. I think it's too early to tell whether that will be an effective political weapon. And we have the congressional midterms coming up. Biden has another 3.5 years or something to. So I wouldn't go so far as to say that this is the end of Joe Biden, but I would say that this is another signpost to the end of the American empire.
And do you think that anyone else other than you in the United States sees that already, or are they seeing it but hiding it?
Well, all the people who see it, the critics of empire, Andrew Bacevich, Noam Chomsky, Danny Shorson, who graduated from West Point, served as a combat officer in Afghanistan and Iraq, Alfred McCoy. I mean, there are plenty of critics of empire, but you'll never watch them on MSNBC or any other major network where you just get Petraeus, and who was in charge of the military operations at one point in both Iraq and Afghanistan, and went on and later led the CIA. Leon Panetta also led the CIA. I mean, these are the only voices that you hear. The critics of empire have been completely washed out of the media. And so the very architects of the disaster are now justifying. Petraeus had this there was this fawning piece about Petraeus in the New Yorker magazine a couple years ago, and he's essentially blaming Biden for his own ineptitude. I find it a remarkable event that the media just won't. I mean, John Bolton, of all people, his voice is saturated over the media landscape. These are the people that made the mess, and they're never held to it. Not only not held to account, but they're lionized by the very media entities that, if they were doing their journalistic duty, would be scrutinizing the disaster that they organized and for many years led.
And what of the Liberals that were so dewy-eyed at Joe Biden because he wasn't Donald Trump? The paroxysms of joy on CNN, MSNBC, and in the Washington Post and the Times and so on. How do they feel today?
Well, they've been largely defensive of Biden. The critique revolves around the way the United States withdrew. Could we have left 3,500, I think was the number, of combat support troops behind? Biden is really handled quite gently by the quote unquote liberal media. But let's remember that Biden, again, was one of the architects of these wars. In fact, especially with the invasion of Iraq, Biden, as a senator, played a very major role in organizing support and calling out for the war. So the Republicans, who are culpable as well, of course, the Republican Party started the war in Afghanistan under George W. Bush, they are using this like a bludgeon. But that's to be expected among a clashing kind of political class. And their voices are being amplified throughout the media. But I would say the liberal media, like the New York Times, the Washington Post, those CNN, they have been since before the election extremely protective of Biden because he represents the return to the I would call the kind of gravitas of the empire that Donald Trump so consistently exploded through his ineptitude and vulgarisms. And it's not that they were particularly against what Trump did. Trump served the empire and Wall Street as assiduously as anyone else. It was more the presentation to the rest of the world, and that's why they got Biden, who is kind of, as you pointed out, in and out. We don't really know how much he's there or how much he isn't there, but he's a good figurehead for the empire.
But these empire loyalists, finally, they must know in their heart that they've just received one hell of a beating from ragged-assed men on bicycles with Kalashnikovs. It must be very difficult for them to deny that, at least to themselves.
I don't know. I mean, if you turned on American television channels, the principal theme is that we did not lose to the Taliban. We beat ourselves. I mean, you have former National Security Advisor H.R. McMaster calling it self-defeat. Eugene Robinson, who's a columnist for the Washington Post, is calling it a war we did not win. So and I watched this at the end of the Vietnam War. I was a kid, but it was the same rhetoric. You never heard the word defeat, and you're not hearing that now.
There'll be a whole generation of Hollywood movies.
Right.
Already, they'll be receiving the scripts right now, and it'll be how dreadful it was that the Afghans made the Americans do all this to themselves. Chris Hedges, thank you very much indeed for another masterful tour of the political horizon. Many thanks for joining us.